This is a true crime in real time update from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.
She was ice cold, he said. Those were his words. Spoken casually into a jailhouse phone like he was describing leftovers gone bad in the fridge. But he wasn't. He was talking about a 13-year-old girl, Maddie Soto. The child who had gone missing, whose face lit up digital billboards and news alerts, whose body was found days later dumped in a remote area of Central Florida. And the man saying those words, Stephan Sterns, wasn't just anyone. He was her mother's boyfriend. He was the last person confirmed to see Maddie alive. And now, according to prosecutors, he's the man who killed her. That phone call, one of dozens recorded by the jail and released publicly in 2025, flipped this case on its head. What had started as a missing persons investigation spiraled into something so much worse. The tapes didn't just contradict his prior statements. They offered a chilling glimpse into a man who seemed to be processing the horror he'd caused, not with urgency or remorse, but with a kind of eerie, matter-of-fact resignation. Let's back up just slightly. The jailhouse calls were made roughly 3 months after Sterns was arrested. At that point, he was already sitting in the Osceola County Jail, facing dozens of child sex abuse charges. But it wasn't until April 2024 that he was formally indicted for first-degree murder in Maddie's death. Then, the state dropped another bomb. They would seek the death penalty. Fast forward to early 2025, and prosecutors made the strategic decision to release around 4 hours of recorded phone calls between Sterns and his parents. These weren't accidentally leaked. This was intentional. They knew what they were doing, letting the public hear his voice, letting the contradictions speak for themselves. Because Sterns had already given one version of events to police, that he dropped Maddie off at school the morning she disappeared, that he went on with his day as normal, that he had no idea where she went. But on the calls, that story changes. In one of the earliest calls released, Sterns tells his parents he found her unresponsive. At home. She was pale, he said. Lips blue. Ice cold. It was too late, he added. She was gone. He describes wishing he'd shaken her awake, wishing he had called 911. And as he says these things, there's no sobbing, no panic in his voice, no disbelief. It sounds more like he's explaining how he forgot to put out the trash. This, of course, directly contradicts what he told law enforcement. At the time Maddie vanished, he said he dropped her off, that he went to a vape shop, that everything was normal. But these phone calls show he's telling his parents something completely different. And that difference isn't a small one. It's the difference between being a concerned bystander and being the last person to see a child alive, who admits to being there when she died. Still, even with that admission, Sterns never actually says he killed her. He walks a very specific line. He says it was all an accident. He tells his parents he snapped, that he wasn't thinking clearly, that his mind wasn't right. He says he regrets not calling for help, but never quite says what happened before she stopped breathing. That gray space, that's where the legal strategy lives. He's admitting proximity. He's acknowledging something terrible happened, but he's carefully avoiding the words that would lock him into guilt. You hear it when his mother, Deborah, tries to make sense of what he's saying. She doesn't lash out. She doesn't scream. She's confused. She's clearly devastated, but she's also giving him room to talk. Like she's hoping he'll say something that makes it all okay. Something that explains why her son is now facing the possibility of death by lethal injection. At one point, she says, "I could never have imagined that we would all be in this situation. This is awful." You can feel the weight of that sentence. This wasn't just a family in crisis. This was a family grappling with the reality that their son might be a monster. His dad, Chris, also chimes in during some of the calls. He pushes a little harder than Deborah. He asks more direct questions. At one point, he urges Sterns to clear things up, saying, if others were involved, let's get that cleared up. If not for you, for the family. That moment is key because it reveals two things. One, that his father might believe someone else could be involved, and two, that Sterns himself may have implied as much. But here's the thing. Law enforcement has made it clear no one else is being charged. No one else is suspected. All the evidence points to Sterns alone, and it's not just the fact that he was with Maddie the morning she vanished. It's what came after. Because once Maddie's body was found, once investigators got a hold of Sterns' phone and devices, they uncovered a disturbing cache of images and videos, material that led to over 60 counts of sexual abuse charges. But we'll get into the forensics later. What matters here in these calls is how Sterns addresses those allegations with his parents. Because again, he doesn't outright deny anything. When they ask him about the photos found on his phone, photos investigators say clearly depict Maddie in sexually abusive situations. He dodges. He says he's not generally attracted to minors, that he can't get into details. He says he doesn't want to incriminate himself. This is a guy sitting in jail facing life in prison or worse, and when his own parents ask him if he was abusing a child, he gives them the kind of answer you'd expect from a lawyered-up politician at a press conference. It's calculated, it's vague, it's telling. And then it gets weirder, because Sterns starts telling them that Maddie had feelings for him. He claims Jennifer Soto, Maddie's mother, and his then-girlfriend joked about it. That she once said, "You better not leave me for my daughter." He says Jennifer allowed Maddie to sleep in his bed. He even references something called an Electra complex, like he's pulling out Freud to justify the unjustifiable. Now, to be clear, Jennifer Soto has not been charged with anything. She's denied knowing about any abuse. But Sterns' attempts to shift blame, or at least muddy the waters, are plain to see. He implies that Maddie was emotionally attached to him, that Jennifer ignored warning signs, that somehow this wasn't just on him. And again, his mother is clearly shaken. She asks why, if Jennifer suspected something, she would have allowed Maddie to sleep in his bed. It's a normal reaction. It's the question anyone would ask. But Sterns doesn't answer it directly. He just goes back to saying Jennifer used to joke, that it wasn't serious, that everyone misunderstood everything. This is the theme that runs through all of these calls: evasion, deflection, regret, but always just short of responsibility. He wishes things were different. He wishes he'd called for help. He wishes things had gone another way, but he never outright says, "I did this." And maybe the most haunting part of the recordings is how comfortable he seems discussing his own potential execution. Murder 1 is about as bad as it can get, he tells them. The death penalty is about as extreme as it can go. And then he adds, "I guess that's not so bad, right? You go to sleep, and then you go to heaven." Like he's ordering a sedative and a prayer. That line, "You go to sleep, and then you go to heaven," hits different when you remember that a 13-year-old girl was found dumped in the woods 5 days after she vanished. That her cause of death was strangulation. That a man who called her ice cold is sitting in jail, talking about his own death with the same energy most people use to talk about a nap. He tells his parents he's at peace with the idea, that living out his life in a cage might actually be worse. And he says something else too, that if he becomes the fall guy, then so be it. Again, implying there's more to the story. But when pushed, he never gives details, never names anyone, just vague phrases, just enough to make people wonder, but not enough to make anyone else a suspect. And that's the thing. Law enforcement has been clear, he's it. No co-conspirators, no mystery accomplices, just Sterns. The guy who once coached volleyball. The guy who dated a single mom. The guy who now sits in jail mulling over execution like it's just one more bad option in a life that's already gone off the rails. These calls, these taped conversations, weren't just damning because of what Sterns said. They were damning because of how he said it. There's a chill to them, a flatness. Like he's narrating someone else's story. Like he still hasn't fully come to terms with the gravity of what he's accused of doing. Or worse, maybe he has. And while he talks about blankets that itch and the lack of decent coffee in jail, the recordings are already out there. The public has heard his words, the prosecutors have them queued up, and his defense team knows those calls aren't going away. They're part of the case now, part of the evidence, part of what the jury will eventually have to weigh if this thing goes to trial. Because it's not just about what was found on his phone, or the footage from that morning, or the cadaver dog alerting in his car. It's about his own words, his own mouth, saying things he can't unsay, placing himself where he once denied being, talking like a man who knows the door is closing and fast, But these calls were just the beginning of what 2025 had in store. Because after prosecutors let the public hear Sterns' voice, law enforcement pulled back the curtain even more. What they found in his car, what they saw on surveillance footage, and how his story kept changing, it all came next. And that's where the weight of the case really started to stack up. When investigators opened the door to Stephan Sterns' car, they weren't just looking for DNA, they were looking for truth. Because at that point, his words were already slippery. The jailhouse calls had made that much clear. So law enforcement turned to the kind of evidence that doesn't shift with emotion or strategy. They brought in the dogs, and that's when it hit, literally. A K9 trained to detect the scent of human decomposition alerted in the front passenger seat. Not the back, not the trunk, right there in the front, the spot where a living person should sit upright, alert, moving. But what investigators believed they saw in surveillance footage from that very morning was the opposite. A slumped figure, a motionless body, a child in a position that officers described as not how a person would sit. This wasn't some vague shadow or grainy image. According to the documents released in March 2025, that surveillance footage showed Maddie Soto in Sterns' car in an unnatural position with no visible signs of movement. And it backed up the cadaver dog's reaction. That's not just suspicion anymore, that's science and tech lining up to tell the same story. Remember, this was February 26th, 2024, the day Maddie was reported missing. The day Sterns told police he dropped her off at school, then went to a vape shop. But now, with the footage, the dog alert, and new interview transcripts, that story has officially cracked in half. Because when detectives sat Sterns down for another round of questioning, he changed the narrative again. This time, he admitted Maddie never went into the school. He said she was asleep in the passenger seat while he went into the shop. His words, she was just conked out napping. Not missing, not in danger. Just peacefully napping in a reclined seat while he ran errands. Except here's the thing, people don't nap themselves into rigor mortis, and investigators didn't buy it. It's a classic move in these types of cases. Adjust your story just enough to fit what you think police know. Sterns had done it before. The original version was that he dropped her off. Then he adjusted it. Said she stayed in the car, and sure enough, the surveillance footage caught her slumped in that seat. But when you factor in the K9 alert for human remains, that version of the story becomes more than just suspicious. It starts to look calculated. That wasn't the only problem with his statement. The vape shop timing didn't hold up cleanly either. Investigators checked surveillance and timestamps, cross-referenced locations, tracked GPS data from Sterns' phone. It all pointed to the same thing. He was with Maddie longer than he originally said. Long enough for something irreversible to happen. What made it worse for Sterns was the growing list of inconsistencies. This wasn't just one bad lie told in panic. It was a chain of corrections, backpedals, and careful wording. And with each new shift in his version of events, the evidence stayed steady. Unmoving. Maddie was last seen alive with him. Her body was later found miles away. And the car she was in had the chemical signatures of decomposition in the seat where Sterns claimed she was napping. But let's zoom in a bit, because beyond the physical evidence, the psychology matters here. When a person is telling the truth, their story tends to stay the same. The details might shift slightly, memory's a funny thing, but the foundation holds. When someone's lying, the structure warps. It bends to fit the facts as they emerge. That's exactly what was happening with Sterns. The more the investigators revealed, the more his version morphed, and the law enforcement team noticed. Every time Sterns changed his story, they saw it as a tell, a little signal of guilt. Not proof by itself, but one more weight on the scale. There was also something else building in the background that couldn't be ignored: the digital evidence. Law enforcement had already secured warrants to search Sterns' devices after his initial arrest. What they found, especially on his phone and in a Google Drive account, became the backbone of the sexual abuse case. Dozens of disturbing images and videos, some of them clearly involving Maddie, files with dates, metadata, screen captures. Photos investigators later said were deeply troubling, all of it pointing toward prolonged abuse. By 2025, Sterns' legal team had started attacking the validity of that digital evidence. In February, they filed a flurry of motions trying to suppress what was found. They argued that the searches were unconstitutional, that the warrants were too broad, that the investigators overstepped. One motion focused on the Google Drive account, claiming it had been accessed improperly. Another challenged how the phone itself was seized. But here's the catch. Sterns voluntarily handed his phone over in the early stages of the missing persons investigation. He wasn't a suspect yet, just the boyfriend helping with a search. He gave it to them thinking it might help, thinking he had nothing to hide. And then the digital floodgates opened. If that detail holds up in court, the suppression argument might not stand. If it doesn't, if the judge agrees the warrant was too wide, then the entire digital evidence stack could be on the line. That matters, because those files don't just form the basis of the abuse case, they also show a pattern, a timeline. They tell a story that the prosecutors will likely argue leads straight to Maddie's death. At the same time, law enforcement kept the public focused on the bigger picture. Around the 1-year mark of Maddie's disappearance, Osceola County investigators released even more files. New reports, surveillance photos, forensic results. These weren't leaks. They were calculated disclosures. Drops of truth meant to signal confidence in their case, and maybe to remind the public exactly who they believe killed Maddie Soto. Those strategic releases didn't include everything. The full autopsy report remains sealed. Florida law protects the privacy of minor victims. But what was released continued to build a picture that didn't change. Sterns was the last person with Maddie. His story kept shifting. The science didn't. It also became clear that, despite Sterns' implications on the jail calls, law enforcement had no intention of pursuing charges against anyone else. Jennifer Soto, Maddie's mother, was not considered a suspect. She was questioned, scrutinized, but no charges. No arrest. Even as Sterns floated ideas in his phone calls about shared blame. Maybe everyone is to blame a little bit, he said. Investigators rejected that outright. The trail, in their view, ended with him. And as all of this built behind the scenes, the foundation of the case continued to solidify, not around what Sterns said in his own defense, but around what he couldn't explain away. The footage, the dog alert, the digital files, the surveillance footage that didn't match his timeline, the phone interviews where his story took another hard left. There's a reason law enforcement didn't rush to trial. They were still building, still stacking each piece. Every interview, every test, every phone ping, these were the blocks they were laying down, brick by brick, until what they had wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a wall. One Sterns would eventually have to try and scale in front of a jury. But that wall isn't made of emotion. It's made of data, footage, timestamps, reactions, forensic hits. And that's the kind of evidence that doesn't care how someone feels. It doesn't forget. It doesn't change under pressure. It just is. And as Sterns sat in his jail cell, describing itchy blankets and cheap toothpaste to his parents, that evidence was waiting. Quietly, methodically, just like the investigation itself. Because long before a courtroom sees this case, law enforcement already made their position clear. They believe Maddie Soto died in that house, that her body was moved in that car, that the man who called her ice cold had known that for a very long time. And while the public was absorbing that information, prosecutors were preparing for the next front in the war, the courtroom, the place where stories and evidence collide, and where Sterns' team would do everything they could to keep key evidence out, challenge the charges, and most of all, try to keep their client off death row. By the time 2025 was in full swing, the investigation had already passed the point of no return. The focus wasn't just on what Stephan Sterns had said or what he had done, it was on what could be proven in court. And the battle lines were starting to take shape. This wasn't about public opinion anymore. This was about what evidence stayed in and what evidence got tossed. It was about motions, deadlines, legal loopholes, and two words that carried more weight than anything else in the room: death penalty. Sterns' attorneys came in swinging. They weren't just trying to poke holes in the state's timeline or raise doubt about his behavior. They were trying to gut the case at its core by going after the very evidence that made it so damning. In early February, his legal team filed close to 50 pretrial motions. And these weren't just for show. They were a strategic attempt to chip away at the foundation prosecutors had been building since the day Maddie disappeared. At the top of the list was the digital evidence, the same files that allegedly showed sexually explicit material involving Maddie. The same data pulled from Sterns' phone and Google Drive. The defense argued that much of it had been collected through unlawful searches, that the warrants were overly broad, that investigators had exceeded their authority when they dug into his devices. One motion focused on the Google Drive itself, claiming the state had gone too far in its reach. Another targeted the phone, even though Sterns had voluntarily handed it over at the start of the investigation. The defense's position? Just because he gave them the phone to help with a missing child search didn't mean they had permission to comb through every corner of it. They argued that once the nature of the investigation shifted, once it was no longer about a missing child but a potential murder, the rules changed. The warrants needed to be updated, more specific, narrower in scope. Otherwise, they claimed, everything found after that point should be thrown out. The stakes couldn't be higher. If the judge sides with the defense, the prosecution could lose key pieces of their case, dozens of charges related to child sexual abuse, and the powerful suggestion of a long pattern of predatory behavior. If the judge rejects the motion, then everything stays in. Every file, every photo, every timestamp. It all comes in front of a jury, where the prosecution will likely use it not just to prove the abuse, but to argue intent and motive in Maddie's death. As that fight brewed in the background, another one took center stage, the death penalty. Florida is one of the few states that still actively uses capital punishment. In fact, it expanded it in 2023, lowering the threshold for a death sentence from a unanimous jury vote to a supermajority, 8 out of 12. That change made waves across the legal world, and Sterns' attorneys saw it as an opportunity. They filed motions arguing that the revised law was unconstitutional, that allowing a death sentence without a unanimous jury was a violation of his rights, that the process itself was fundamentally broken. One of those motions, filed at the end of January, directly challenged the state's decision to seek death in Sterns' case. They argued that the law as written left too much room for error, too much room for bias, that it lowered the bar for something irreversible. The motion didn't deny that Sterns was charged with first-degree murder. It didn't try to reframe what happened to Maddie. It just tried to take the death penalty off the table. For the defense, this wasn't about proving innocence. It was about survival, about getting their client, if convicted, a shot at life in prison instead of execution, about planting seeds of doubt and constitutionality that could bloom into appeals, delays, or maybe, if the cards fell just right, a life sentence instead of death. But the state wasn't budging. Prosecutors filed their own briefs, arguing the law was valid, the evidence was strong, and the crime justified the harshest punishment available. Maddie Soto wasn't just a murder victim, they said. She was a child, a vulnerable, innocent girl who had allegedly been abused, manipulated, and ultimately killed by someone she trusted. In their view, this wasn't just a capital case. And while the two sides argued over warrants and statutes, another storm was brewing, one that had nothing to do with evidence or law. It had to do with the spotlight. The media coverage of this case had been relentless. From true crime podcasts to nightly news, TikToks to Reddit threads, the case of Maddie Soto and Stephan Sterns was everywhere. People weren't just following it, they were dissecting it, commenting on it. Theories were flying, rumors were spinning, and every court hearing brought new fuel to the fire. So on March 20th, Sterns' legal team made a bold move. They asked the judge to kick everyone out, not the jury, not the lawyers, the public, the press. They filed a motion to close all pretrial hearings from this point forward, arguing that the coverage had reached a level that made a fair trial impossible. That every headline, every viral clip, every social media post was poisoning the well, making it harder and harder to find 12 people who could sit in a box and judge the case on facts alone. Sterns himself appeared in court for that hearing, the first time in months. His public defender, Alicia Smith, presented a full slideshow in court, showing just how far the coverage had spread. Screenshots from YouTube, TikToks dissecting the jail calls, Reddit posts accusing everyone and their cousin of being involved. It was a digital avalanche, and Smith argued that there was no way to stop it, so the only solution was to take the proceedings offline. Lock the doors. Seal the record. Keep the court focused on the law, not the likes. But the state pushed back, hard. The assistant state attorney reminded the court that pretrial publicity doesn't automatically taint a jury pool. That being well known isn't the same as being unmanageable. That prominence doesn't always mean prejudice. Juror impartiality, he said, does not require ignorance. He had a point. The law doesn't demand that jurors be blank slates, just that they're open-minded, that they can separate fact from rumor. The prosecution argued that with proper questioning and vetting, a fair jury could still be seated in Osceola County. Media outlets weren't staying quiet either. TV and other organizations hired their own attorney to argue for continued access. They cited the First Amendment, the importance of open courtrooms, the public's right to see justice unfold. The judge listened to both sides and said he'd rule within 10 days. As of this writing, that ruling is still pending. But legal analysts agree closing a courtroom is rare. Doing it completely? Almost unheard of. Still, it speaks to just how tense things have become. This case isn't just playing out in legal filings and evidence exhibits. It's playing out in real time, in public, where every move is scrutinized, clipped, and reposted. The courtroom has become just one front in a much bigger war, a war over perception, access, and control. And looming in the distance are the trials themselves. The court has set 2 timelines. The child sexual abuse trial is expected to begin in May 2025, following a short delay from April. The murder trial, where the death penalty is on the line, is tentatively scheduled for September. These dates could still shift. Motions are still pending. Hearings are ongoing. But for now, that's the track. The judge has also been weighing whether to fully separate the 2 trials, to prevent the jury in one from hearing about the allegations in the other. That kind of wall is tough to build, especially in a case where the alleged abuse and the murder are so closely tied. But it's necessary, at least from a legal standpoint. A juror isn't supposed to convict someone for one crime just because they believe he committed another. And while the lawyers sort through those logistics, jury selection methods, evidence disclosures, possible gag orders, the clock is ticking. Witness lists are being prepped. Expert testimony is being lined up. The prosecution is shaping its narrative. The defense is searching for cracks. Because soon this case won't just be about what the public has heard or read. It'll be about what 12 people believe beyond a reasonable doubt. It'll be about whether the story told in jailhouse calls, K-9 alerts, and forensic files is enough to justify a lifetime behind bars, or the ultimate punishment. But before that trial can begin, the battle over what gets admitted and what stays hidden still rages on. And the closer the courtroom doors get to opening, the louder those questions become. What will the jury see? What won't they? What's fair in the pursuit of justice? And what crosses the line? The next few months may decide that. And when the trial finally begins, what's at stake isn't just one man's fate. It's the truth about what happened to Maddie Soto.
The neighborhood was picture perfect. Manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, friendly smiles exchanged over white picket fences. And then there was him, the guy who never made eye contact, the one who only left his house at night, dragging black trash bags to the curb, bags that sometimes twitched. He's just a little odd, they said, just keeps to himself, until the smell started. Until the missing pets turned into missing people. Until someone finally had the nerve to peek inside that basement window. And if they had only subscribed to True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts, they could have listened to Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi ad-free. And before everyone else, they could have recognized the warning signs. They could have gotten out. But they didn't. And now, they're part of the next episode. Don't make the same mistake. Subscribe now to True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts.